In the stillness of dawn, when the savannah holds its breath between night and day, a man sipping bitter tea sees something that will haunt and humble him forever. A wild leopard, golden as firelight and silent as wind, emerges from the tall grass, not to hunt, but to beg. In her jaws, limp and bloodied, lies a cub on the brink of death. And instead of vanishing into the wild, she walks straight toward his door. This isn't a wildlife documentary. This is a true story of trust, grief, and a question that defies reason. Why would a predator place her hope in a human? In the stillness of dawn, when the savannah holds its breath between night and day, a man sipping bitter tea sees something that will haunt and humble him forever. A wild leopard, golden as firelight and silent as wind, emerges from the tall grass, not to hunt, but to beg. In her jaws, limp and bloodied, lies a cub on the brink of death. And instead of vanishing into the wild, she walks straight toward his door. This isn't a wildlife documentary. This is a true story of trust, grief, and a question that defies reason. Why would a predator place her hope in a human? The visitor at dawn. After losing his wife to cancer 3 years prior, Elias had retreated from the world. Now his days were filled with tracking zebra migrations, recording hyena calls, and tending to the small memorial garden outside the hut where his wife once planted wild basil. He sipped the bitter brew, black, no sugar, and squinted into the distance. At this hour, animals were usually just returning from the night hunt. Hyenas yipped in the distance, and a pair of giraffes grazed lazily near the ridge. It was peaceful, predictable, until a subtle movement shifted in the corner of his vision. At first, Elias assumed it was a warthog or stray impala brushing against the brush. But something about the motion felt off. He narrowed his eyes. Not the quick twitch of prey, nor the stalk of a predator. It was deliberate, weighted, heavy. Then he saw her. Out of the early morning haze, stepping through the dewy grass, came a leopard. Not just any leopard, she was enormous, regal. Her coat shimmered in the light, a breathtaking mosaic of golden fur and dark rosette-shaped spots. Her belly was lean but strong, her steps cautious, but not fearful. Her ears flicked once. Then again. Her breath came heavy. Elias froze. Even after 20 years working in African wilderness, a close encounter with a wild leopard was no small event. They were elusive, secretive. He'd gone entire seasons without seeing one in person. And now, here she was, approaching his porch. But this was no ordinary approach. She wasn't crouched in the posture of a stalker. Her tail didn't twitch like a predator's about to pounce. No, this was something different. As she stepped into full view, Elias's heart skipped a beat. Hanging from her mouth was a leopard cub. It dangled loosely, too loosely. The cub's right leg hung at an unnatural angle. One shoulder was matted with dried blood. Its small body twitched faintly, but otherwise lay limp in the mother's powerful jaws. Elias's instinct screamed at him to back away, to close the door, to retreat into safety. But he didn't move. The mother leopard kept walking. 20 meters. 15. 10. Elias remained rooted, eyes locked with hers. What he saw there was not the wild, savage glare of an apex predator. It was something softer, something ancient, desperation. A silent plea carved into the amber of her gaze. The distance between them vanished. She climbed 2 short steps onto the porch and stopped. Carefully, deliberately, she set the cub down on the wooden boards, just feet from Elias's boots. The cub whimpered weakly, its breath rasping in and out. The leopard backed away slightly, but did not retreat. Elias could feel it now, thick in the air, a moment suspended between 2 worlds, man and beast, life and death, reason and instinct. And in that silence, as the wind rustled the grass behind her, Elias heard a question he'd never imagined a wild animal would ask. "Will you help her?" Elias knelt slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements. His heart hammered so violently in his chest he feared it might spook the leopard, or worse, her injured cub. But Azara, as he would later come to name her, did not flinch. She remained on the edge of the porch, unmoving, her amber eyes locked onto him with an expression far too complex to label. The cub lay still, a trembling mass of golden fluff marred by blood and dirt. Up close, Elias could see more clearly. She was young, maybe 4 weeks old, her fur patchy and soft like worn silk. The injury on her shoulder was severe, A puncture wound, deep and ugly, crusted with dried blood. Her breathing was labored, each inhale a painful gasp, each exhale a soft moan. Without thinking, Elias whispered, "You're just a baby, aren't you?" The cub twitched at the sound of his voice. Her ears fluttered, and her eyes, clouded but aware, fluttered half open. That small, nearly imperceptible reaction tugged something in Elias's chest, something buried for a long time. He hadn't spoken to anyone in days. And now he was speaking to a dying cub on his porch, under the unblinking gaze of her deadly mother. His hands trembled as he removed the old canvas shirt tied around his waist. Gently, almost reverently, he wrapped the tiny body in the fabric, cradling her as if she were porcelain. The moment he lifted her, the mother leopard hissed, low and sharp, just once. Elias froze. Azara stepped forward. But she didn't strike. She didn't growl again. She simply sat down, just 3 feet away, watching him with eyes that burned and shimmered in the soft light. No animal had ever looked at him like that. It wasn't challenge. It wasn't fear. It was trust. And that terrified him more than any claws ever could. Cradling the cub, Elias backed through the door, never breaking eye contact with Azara. He didn't close the door behind him. He couldn't. He placed the cub gently on the wooden table by the window, where the sun pooled like golden honey. Outside, the mother leopard remained a silent shadow, standing guard. The line between man and nature had just been crossed, and Elias knew, even if the cub survived, nothing in his world would ever be the same again. The unthinkable act, Abon, begins. The air inside the cabin felt thick, like it carried the weight of 100 unspoken questions. Elias gently laid the cub, still wrapped in his shirt, on the worn wooden table near the window. The morning sun spilled across her fur, revealing more of the damage: torn flesh along her upper leg, dried blood around her ear, and a faint wheezing sound that grew more strained with each breath. He rummaged through a dented metal cabinet and pulled out a dusty first aid tin. Alcohol wipes, a dull pair of scissors, gauze, and a rusted pair of tweezers. It wasn't much. "I'm not a vet," he muttered aloud. "Hell, I'm barely a person these days." The cub whimpered in response, her tiny jaw trembling. Elias froze. That sound, it wasn't just pain. It was pleading. He got to work, slowly and carefully. He trimmed the matted fur around the wound, cleaned the area with antiseptic, and tried not to flinch when the cub jerked from the sting. Her little body was hot, feverish. Infection had already begun to set in. Elias knew enough about big cats to recognize a territorial injury. A male leopard had likely attacked her. It was brutal but natural. In the wild, a new dominant male often kills cubs to bring the mother back into mating readiness. It was the cruel clockwork of nature, efficient, emotionless. And yet, here was this cub, bleeding out in the arms of a man who hadn't touched another living soul in weeks. And outside, her mother, the predator feared by all, was waiting, watching, hoping. This wasn't just biology anymore. Elias reached for his old satellite phone, one he hadn't used in over a month. He dialed the only number that still mattered in his contacts. "Maya Anders," answered a woman's voice on the third ring. It was groggy, irritated. "It's Elias," he said quickly. "I need your help. I have a leopard cub, injured bad. The mother brought her to me." There was silence. Then laughter. "Is this a joke?" "I wish it was." He explained. Short, clipped phrases. Injuries. The mother outside. The cub's condition. Maya didn't laugh again. "I'll be there in an hour," she said. "Don't let her die." Elias returned to the table. The cub's eyes fluttered open, just for a second, and fixed on him. She didn't flinch, didn't growl. Her breath rattled, but her gaze held. "I guess it's just you and me, little one," he whispered. Outside, Azara had not moved an inch. She sat like a statue beneath the twisted acacia tree, her gaze fixed on the door. Not a snarl. Not a twitch of her tail. Only waiting. And it struck Elias. She had made a choice. Against instinct. Against logic. She had chosen him. A man who had lost everything. A man who hadn't saved anyone in years. And now, in this absurd twist of fate, a wild leopard had handed him her dying child, and with it, a chance at redemption he never asked for. From the narrow window above the sink, Elias could see her. Azara hadn't moved from her post beneath the acacia. The sun was higher now, casting soft beams through the leaves, dappling her golden coat with shifting patches of light and shadow. Her ears twitched occasionally at the sounds of the savannah, hornbills calling in the distance, the faint rustle of something small skittering through the underbrush, but her eyes never left the cabin. Elias didn't know what to make of it. He'd studied leopards his entire career, read their patterns, tracked their kills, marveled at their stealth, but this defied every known behavior. Leopards didn't loiter. They didn't linger near humans. And they certainly didn't wait. But Azara was waiting. Inside, the cub's breathing was shallow but rhythmic. Elias had wrapped her in soft towels and placed a hot water bottle under her chest to keep her temperature stable. A dropper filled with honey and warm goat milk lay nearby. She hadn't accepted it yet, but he kept trying, offering a drop at a time, his hand steady despite his heart's frantic beat. He looked back at the window. Azara blinked. Not a slow, lazy blink of a predator at ease, but a deliberate one. It reminded Elias of the way his wife used to wordlessly reassure him. He felt the ridiculous thought rising, "Is she checking on me?" He shook his head. The mind plays strange tricks under pressure. The low rumble of an engine in the distance broke the silence. Maya. Her white Land Cruiser appeared over the ridge, kicking up red dust as it descended the rough dirt path. As the vehicle drew closer, Elias rushed outside, waving her down. Maya stepped out, a tall woman in her 30s with a sun-scorched face and no-nonsense gait. She had a tranquilizer gun slung over her shoulder, though her hand never went near it. Her eyes locked onto Azara instantly. "My God," she whispered. "She's just watching." Elias nodded. They stood in the open, not 10 meters from a full-grown leopard, with no barrier between them. "She brought the cub to me," he said. "She hasn't left since." Maya's eyes softened. "I've seen things in this job I'll never forget," she said. "But this is something else." Without another word, they entered the cabin together. Outside, Azara remained a silent sentinel. She wasn't there to attack. She was there to hope. The fight for survival, naming her Saba. For the next 12 hours, Elias and Maya became makeshift surgeons in a hut that was never built to house miracles. They worked in near silence, save for the occasional hiss of antiseptic or Maya's calm instructions. The cub's breathing remained shallow, but steady, each rise and fall of her tiny chest a small defiance against death. Her body remained curled tightly, her back legs still limp and motionless. The infected wound on her shoulder, once crusted and inflamed, was now cleaned, stitched, and dressed. "She's not out of danger," Maya murmured, wiping sweat from her brow. "But she's fighting." Elias stared at the cub nestled in a towel-lined fruit crate. He hadn't looked away from her for more than a few minutes at a time. Exhaustion crept behind his eyes like an unwanted shadow, but he couldn't sleep. Not yet. The cub shifted slightly, emitting a breathy, rasping mewl. "She needs a name," Maya said gently. Elias blinked. "A name." "Names carry strength," she replied, pouring a few drops of honey milk into a tiny syringe. "Especially for fighters." Elias glanced at the cub. Her coat, though matted, was dappled with distinct black rosettes. Beneath the grime, she was beautiful. Fragile. Fierce. "Saba," he said, the word rolling from his tongue like instinct. "It means 7 in Swahili." "Why 7? "She'll need all 7 lives to survive this." Maya smiled faintly. "Then let's make sure she gets them." Every 2 hours, they fed her in turns, honey, milk, glucose. Every shift in her breathing was logged, every tremor checked. Maya had placed a makeshift 4-line in her hind leg to deliver fluids. Elias kept the cabin warm with coals and oil lamps. He read old field manuals, rechecked vitals, wrote everything down in a worn leather notebook he hadn't touched since his wife's passing. Outside, Azara had not moved. She vanished for an hour once, perhaps to hunt, and returned with a fresh hair laid gently near the porch. She made no sound, no advance toward the door. She simply resumed her position under the tree, her golden eyes ever watchful. "She's helping," Maya whispered. "In her own way." By nightfall, Elias had converted half the cabin into an emergency ward. He removed books from shelves to make room for gauze and medications. He moved his cot beside the crate, refusing to sleep out of reach. That night, Saba whimpered again. Elias reached out instinctively, placing his hand beside her. Her tiny paw pressed into his palm. It lasted just a second, just long enough to quiet both her cries and his thoughts. That single gesture, raw and instinctual, undid something inside Elias he didn't even know was still tightly wound. "I won't let you go," he whispered. And somewhere outside, the mother leopard blinked slowly, still silent, still watching. In that fragile triangle of trust, mother, cub, man, something unspoken had been formed. It wasn't ownership. It wasn't control. It was stewardship. Responsibility handed down in silence. And Elias understood, perhaps for the first time in years, what it meant to be needed. By the second morning, Saba's fever had eased slightly. Her breath, once shallow and rattling, now came in softer, steadier rhythms. It wasn't recovery, not yet, but it was movement in the right direction. Maya sat at Elias's dining table, her laptop open, medical charts glowing on the screen. She was a field vet, but also deeply rooted in science. Protocols. Data. Controlled observations. And none of this made any sense. "She shouldn't have brought her here," she said for the third time. "It's not in their behavior profile. Female leopards relocate cubs to dens, not to humans. Especially not injured ones." Elias didn't answer. He was on the floor beside the crate, gently adjusting the towel beneath Saba. Her ears twitched in response. That was new. "She didn't choose randomly," he finally murmured. "She watched me. She had to." Maya looked up. "You think she studied you?" He nodded slowly. "I work mostly alone. I walk the same trails. I never carry a gun. I stay out of their hunting zones. Maybe she's seen me dozens of times. But to trust you?" Maya leaned back, clearly torn between her scientific training and the raw magic of what she was witnessing. "Science can't measure desperation," Elias said. "Or hope." Maya fell silent. The hut felt like it existed outside time now, half hospital, half sanctuary. Each corner buzzed with tension. Even the air outside seemed charged, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Later that afternoon, Maya stepped outside and took a few cautious steps toward Azara. She knelt down, a safe distance away, and placed a small bowl of water and another piece of raw rabbit, carefully prepared to avoid human scent, on a stone. Azara didn't move but turned her head ever so slightly. It was an acknowledgement. "That," Maya said, walking back inside, "isn't just instinct. That's intention." For a moment, neither spoke. In the vast savannah, life was often cruel and calculated. But here in this remote cabin, something had broken through, something beyond scientific language and behavioral charts. A dying cub. A grieving mother. A broken man. And something in the middle, trust, raw and sacred, bloomed quietly in the dust. The road to healing, between life and wildness. By the end of the fourth day, Saba was no longer just surviving, she was responding. Her eyes, once cloudy and distant, were now focused and aware. She followed movement across the room. She twitched when Elias adjusted her bedding. Her tail flicked slightly when the wind caught the curtain just right. Still, her front right leg lay limp. The wound had healed externally thanks to Maya's suturing, but something was clearly wrong beneath the surface. A fracture, maybe worse. Maya voiced her concern quietly but firmly that morning as she examined the leg. "She'll never hunt again if that shoulder's broken," she said. "And if she can't hunt, she can't survive in the wild." The words hit Elias harder than he expected. He knew the statistics. Rescued wild animals, especially predators, seldom returned to full independence. But this wasn't just any rescue. This was Saba. And this wasn't just biology anymore, it was something personal. They had scheduled transport to a veterinary clinic nearly 2 hours away, where x-rays could be done, and if needed, surgery. But logistics weren't the only obstacle. There was Azara. She hadn't left. For 4 days, the mother leopard had remained within view of the cabin, sometimes lying under the same acacia tree, sometimes moving silently across the ridge but always returning by dusk. She was thinner now. Tired. Her own survival was being slowly traded for watchfulness. And now Elias was about to take her cub away. How do you explain to a wild creature that you're not stealing her child, but saving her. The crate was ready, padded and warm. The vehicle was fueled. Maya double-checked the straps and sedative dosage, just in case the ride became too rough for the injured cub. Elias lifted Saba gently into the transport box. She let out a soft hiss. Not fear, not aggression. Just resistance. It was the first time she'd shown a hint of wildness. Outside, the door creaked open. Azara was already standing, alert, as if she'd sensed something was about to happen. Elias stepped forward with the crate in his arms. Azara didn't growl. She didn't run. She watched. Only 5 meters separated them now. Elias moved with purpose but with reverence, placing the box into the back of the vehicle. Azara took a slow step forward. Her ears twitched. Her body trembled, not with anger, but with tension. Then, without a sound, she sat. Watching. Unmoving. Elias lingered for a moment longer, heart aching. "I'll bring her back," he whispered, though he knew the words meant little in the wind. The road to the clinic was rough, an endless stretch of red dust and rutted dirt. Every bump made Elias wince, terrified it might undo Saba's fragile progress. Maya drove in silence, focused and fast. "She knew you weren't taking her cub away forever," Maya said at last, gripping the wheel. "She knew. You saw her eyes." Elias stared out the window. "She trusted me more than I trust myself." At the clinic, the X-rays confirmed it, a fractured scapula. Painful, but fixable. Saba would need surgery, then weeks, maybe months, of rehabilitation. A long road. But there was a road. The procedure took nearly 2 hours. Elias never sat. When it was over, the vet gave a simple nod. She made it. Relief washed over Elias like a storm breaking. Not triumph. Just peace. Later that night, with Saba sleeping under soft lights, Elias stood at the window of the clinic's overnight quarters, staring out toward the direction of the savannah. "She's still watching," he whispered, as if Azara could somehow hear him. And deep in the wild, a mother leopard stared into the wind, waiting. The next morning, Elias returned to the cabin alone. The land cruiser crunched over dry grass and scattered stone, but no sound was louder than the emptiness that greeted him. The porch, once watched by golden eyes every morning, was now still. No movement under the acacia tree. No shifting shadow in the tall grass. Azara was gone. Elias stepped onto the porch and looked around slowly. The hair she'd brought days ago had long since been taken by ants. The scent of her musk still lingered faintly in the dirt, a reminder of her vigil. But now, there was nothing. No prints. No low hiss. No silent stare. He stood there for minutes, trying not to feel it, the loss. But it wasn't just grief. It was guilt. He'd taken her cub. Even with good intentions, even with the promise to return her, had she thought he'd betrayed her? He called softly. Once. Twice. Nothing answered but the wind. Inside, the cabin felt too quiet. Too sterile. The crate sat empty on the table where Saba had slept. Her blanket was still there, untouched, the faint indent of her body a ghost of recent memory. Elias touched it absently. Then, as if carried on instinct, he opened the door just wide enough to leave it ajar. Just like he had every night before. Just in case. 3 days passed like that. He returned to the clinic each day to check on Saba. Her recovery was slow but steady. The fracture had been pinned, and she was adjusting to the leg brace. She ate with more vigor now, snapping small chunks of ground meat from the tweezers. Her eyes had regained their fire, her hiss more pronounced. She was becoming a leopard again, stronger, wilder. But at the cabin, no sign of Azara. Not even a whisper of her presence. On the 4th morning, Elias brought Saba back. She was still groggy from the sedatives, wrapped gently in thick cloth, cradled like a newborn. He placed her on her old blanket inside the cabin, where light streamed through the wooden slats, just as it had before. And then, he waited. Hours passed. The sun climbed high and began to fall again. Elias almost gave up. But then, just as the first pink hues touched the sky, a shadow moved near the treeline. A shape emerged. Azara. Thinner. Wearier. But unmistakably her. She walked slowly toward the porch and stopped a few feet away. Elias stood, heart pounding. He said nothing. She didn't approach the door. She simply sat, watching. Elias stepped back inside and picked up Saba, carefully. He placed her near the threshold of the cabin, wrapped in her blanket. The cub stirred faintly, opened her eyes, and for the first time in nearly a week, met her mother's gaze again. No growl. No sound. Just a long, still moment. Then Azara blinked. And in that silent gesture, Elias felt the air shift. Not forgiveness, but trust, again. A place between worlds, building a new wild. The days that followed marked the beginning of something that didn't quite belong to the wild or the civilized. Something suspended in between, held together by trust, effort, and a fragile thread of hope. Elias didn't try to make Azara come closer. He didn't need to. Every morning, he'd leave the cabin door ajar. And every morning Azara would return, sometimes arriving at dawn, other times slipping in just before the sun vanished behind the acacia trees. She never entered the cabin, never crossed the boundary into the human world, but she stayed close. Close enough to see her cub. Close enough to know she hadn't been forgotten. Saba was no longer the helpless bundle Elias had first cradled in his flannel. Though her movement was still limited, the fire in her eyes had returned. She watched birds through the window, her tail twitching in anticipation. She growled softly when unfamiliar sounds passed through the trees. She even attempted to leap once, failing miserably but trying nonetheless. The limp remained. The leg wasn't perfect. But Saba didn't seem to care. She was wild, even within the limits of recovery. She'll never survive on her own, Maya had said the week prior, concern heavy in her voice. Not in the true wild. Elias had nodded then. But now, with Azara outside and Saba inside, both watching each other through a thin barrier, he began to wonder. What if there's a middle ground? That's when the idea came. Elias called James, an old ranger friend who owed him more than a few favors. Within a day, trucks arrived. Posts. Fencing. Netting. Not for captivity, but protection. A perimeter was built around the clearing, stretching into the brush, high and wide but mostly invisible to a wandering eye. It wasn't a cage. It was a sanctuary. Inside the enclosure, Elias recreated a semi-wild environment, brush cover, low tree limbs, hidden meat caches to simulate hunting. A watering hole was dug, fed by a pipe from the nearby stream. Logs and stones were arranged to allow climbing, perching, resting. At the center, a den, crafted with rock and clay and shaded branches. A space big enough for a growing cub and her mother. On the first day the fencing was complete, Elias opened the door. Saba walked. Not far, just a few steps. She sniffed the earth cautiously, felt the breeze on her fur, and looked around. Her movements were clumsy, but her confidence had returned. She didn't glance back. Not once. Azara entered later, slowly. No rush. No drama. Just a quiet reunion. Saba let out a soft chirp, half call, half purr, and Azara responded with a low rumble that made Elias's chest tighten. They didn't run into each other's arms. They weren't human. But their silence said everything. That night, Elias sat on the porch, oil lamp glowing beside him, pen in hand. His journal, untouched for years, now filled with observations, some scientific, most emotional. He watched Azara and Saba settle beneath the moonlight, their golden coats nearly indistinguishable in the silver-blue glow. The wild had reclaimed its own, but not fully. They still needed him. Just a little. And maybe, he needed them just as much. In that space between enclosure and freedom, between solitude and connection, Elias had built something rare. Not ownership. Not rescue. But a bridge. Between two worlds. Weeks passed, and the seasons began to shift. The tall grasses yellowed under the dry sun, and the acacias shed dusty leaves onto the enclosure. With each passing day, Saba grew stronger, her muscles more defined, her movements more feline, less clumsy. But the limp remained, subtle but undeniable. Elias watched it with a quiet ache. He had hoped, naively perhaps, that she would recover fully. That her body might forget the brutality of what had nearly taken her life. But nature didn't erase. It remembered. And Saba wore that memory like a badge. The scar along her shoulder, a jagged mark beneath her golden coat, told a story to anyone who looked. She didn't hide it. She never tried. And Elias began to realize she didn't need to. Her power was not in perfection, but in survival. One morning, just before sunrise, Elias stepped out onto the porch with his cup of strong tea. The air was crisp and cool, and the first blush of daylight painted the clouds soft orange. He leaned on the railing and looked out into the enclosure. There in the open clearing, Saba stood poised, ears forward, tail swaying. A hare had wandered in the night before, slipping through a gap in the perimeter netting. It was near the waterhole, unaware of what fate crouched nearby. Saba moved. Not like a cub. Like a predator. She stayed low, shifting her weight with precision, her injured leg adjusting with an awkward grace that made Elias's throat tighten. She pounced, low, fast, silent. The hare squealed once. Then nothing. From the shadows, Azara emerged and approached her daughter. Saba dropped the prey and looked up. Azara sniffed the catch, then stepped back. A gesture of respect. She had watched, assessed, and understood. Saba had hunted. Not perfectly, but truly. Elias smiled, tears surprising him. It wasn't about returning to the wild completely. It was about knowing that part of it still burned within her, that it hadn't been lost in the injury, in the stitches, in the months of soft hands and human warmth. Later that day, Saba roared for the first time. It was sharp, clear, brief, but unmistakably hers. It echoed off the trees and carried beyond the enclosure. Not a roar of dominance or threat. A declaration. She was no longer the dying cub on a stranger's porch. She was Saba. The scarred. The survivor. The wild thing who learned to trust. The final choice, letting go. By the third month, Elias began to feel something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of quiet completion. The enclosure had become a rhythm. Morning check-ins. Afternoon observations. Evening silence shared between man and beasts. Saba, now nearly 7 months old, no longer fit into the crate that once cradled her broken body. She moved with a confidence that transcended her limp, a fluidity that made her injuries look like nothing more than memories. Her rosette coat shimmered in the morning sun, and her eyes, deep amber like her mother's, were sharp, alert, unblinking. She was ready. But Elias wasn't. Letting go had never been his strong suit. He'd clung to memories of his wife for years. He held on to guilt like it was currency. And now, he clutched Saba's presence like a man afraid to return to a life of silence. Maya noticed first. "You've rebuilt her," she said softly one evening, leaning on the porch railing beside him. "But now it's time to let her rebuild herself." Elias said nothing. His eyes were fixed on Saba, who sat on a low branch inside the enclosure, tail flicking with interest as a bird landed nearby. Azara was stretched beneath the tree, watching her daughter with what Elias could only interpret as a kind of quiet pride. "You've done everything right," Maya added. "But keeping her here. That's about you now. Not her." He flinched. It was the truth. And it stung. That night, Elias sat in the dark long after Maya left, the oil lamp flickering low beside him. His journal lay open on his lap, half-filled pages fluttering in the wind. He read through his own handwriting, notes on her weight gain, her limp, her first attempts at climbing, her hunting instincts, her vocalizations. And then, one entry caught him by surprise. Day 12, she looked at me and didn't blink. For a second, I saw something I didn't expect, something wild, something sacred. She's not mine. She never was. He had known it then. Letting go wasn't surrender. It was respect. The next morning, he removed a section of the enclosure fence. Not all of it. Just one panel, opening into the vast stretch of wild beyond. No fanfare. No dramatic goodbye. Just a door left open. He watched from the porch. Azara noticed first. She stood and walked toward the gap, sniffing the air. Then, without even a glance back, she stepped into the wilderness and disappeared into the tall golden grass. Saba followed. But just before she crossed the threshold, she stopped. Turned her head. And met Elias's eyes. There was no roar. No cry. Just that deep, knowing gaze. Then she turned again, and was gone. Elias stood for a long while, staring at the space where the grass still swayed from her passing. The porch felt empty again. But it was a different kind of emptiness. Not loss. Just space, made ready for the next story. He didn't close the gate. He wouldn't. Because the wild doesn't end at the edge of a fence. It lives in the in-between. In the moments where a man gives back what he was never meant to keep. The savannah was quiet that evening. The kind of silence that feels like it's listening. Elias sat on the porch, the same spot where it all began. The old oil lamp cast a warm glow over his journal, now closed and thick with pages, a chronicle of wounds, healing, and the space between wildness and love. 3 days had passed since Saba and Azara vanished into the tall grass. He hadn't seen them since. Each morning he'd risen early, half expecting to find paw prints in the dust, claw marks on the bark, a shadow in the trees. Nothing. The absence was sharp, but it didn't ache like he feared it would. Instead, it settled in his chest like a quiet pride. They had returned to where they belonged. Still, some part of him lingered in the waiting. Not out of hope, but habit. The same way we glance at an old door, even after it's been closed. Then, on the 4th night, it happened. As the stars began to pierce through the last veil of dusk, Elias caught a flicker of movement in the distance. Barely perceptible. A ripple in the grass. A shimmer of gold. He stood. There, atop a low ridge not far from the clearing, a silhouette emerged under the moonlight. It was Saba. Stronger now, leaner, no longer a cub, but not yet fully grown. She walked with a noticeable hitch in her step, but her posture was proud, head high, tail sweeping low like a true queen of the wild. Behind her, just out of full view, moved a second shape. Azara. The 2 leopards paused at the ridge's crest. Saba turned her head, and even from a distance, Elias saw her glance toward the cabin. A moment passed. Then she lifted her head and let out a low, throaty sound, part growl, part purr. Not a call. Not a goodbye. A presence. An acknowledgement. Then together, they vanished once more into the dark horizon, swallowed by moonlight and savannah grass. Elias sat down, heart full, not with sadness, but with something purer. Peace. Because the wild had returned to the wild. And it had remembered to say thank you. Elias never sought recognition for what he had done. There were no headlines, no documentaries, no scientific papers with his name attached. Only stories whispered around village fires and soft questions from local children who walked by his porch, pointing at the ridge where the leopards were last seen. He preferred it that way. The true reward wasn't fame, it was the memory etched into the land. The sound of a healed cub's roar. The trust in a mother's eyes. The knowledge that just once the great wall between species had crumbled, not with force, but with quiet compassion. Saba's story became something more than a rescue tale. It became a symbol, a lesson, that even in the harshest places, trust can grow. Not instantly. Not easily. But steadily, like roots pushing through stone. A scarred cub, a grieving mother, and a solitary man formed a bond not by words, but by choices, one silent act of surrender at a porch, and every moment of care that followed. Years later, Elias would still leave the gate open. Not because he expected them to return, but because he wanted them to know they could. Sometimes, when the wind rustled just right through the grass, he would swear he heard her. A faint growl. The crunch of paws on dry leaves. And he'd smile, knowing that somewhere out there, the wild still carried a piece of his heart. Because trust, once given freely, never truly leaves. It lingers, in footprints long faded, in trees once used for climbing, in scars that tell stories stronger than skin. And in the quiet places between human and animal, it echoes forever. A legacy. Not of ownership, but of love. And of letting go.